A woman I had never met opened her front door and handed me a pale blue fabric album. She said, "I've been hoping someone would come for these." Inside, my first birthday. My third Christmas. My grandfather held me the day I came home from the hospital. My mother and father were young in a way I had never fully seen. Summer after summer of my childhood, I had not thought to document myself because I had assumed someone else was keeping it. 147 photographs. A handmade album my grandmother had sewn from fabric scraps and filled with my first 3 years of life. Everything that had been given away. 3 years ago, my stepmother organized a charity sale during a move. My childhood photos, all of them, every album, every loose print, the handmade fabric album my grandmother spent a summer making, were packed into a box and sent to a neighbor for distribution. I hadn't known they were gone until I asked for them. And I hadn't known they were safe until a stranger's door opened and a woman said, "I've been hoping someone would come." This is the family ledger. And this is how I got mine back. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are right now. Now let me take you back 31 years to a Tuesday afternoon in September and a woman named Ruth who chose fabric with care because she believed the things you made by hand lasted longer than the things you bought. My name is Tess. I'm 31 years old. And the most important thing I can tell you before this story begins is that my grandmother Ruth understood, without ever saying it directly, that the physical record of a life is one of the only things that travels forward. Ruth was my father's mother. She was 71 when I was born and had already lived a life full enough for 2 people. She had grown up during the Depression. She had raised 4 children in a house that was smaller than most people's living rooms. She had learned to make things last because the alternative was going without, and she had carried that instinct forward into every decade of her life. When I was born, she made me an album. Not a store-bought album, a handmade one. She chose fabric from her sewing box, pale blue with small white flowers, the kind she'd been saving for something that deserved it. And she covered a plain album in it and stitched along the edges with a thread that matched exactly. Inside the front cover, she wrote my name and my birth date in blue ink, the careful cursive of a woman who had good handwriting and used it. She filled the first 20 pages herself with the photographs from my early years. Then she passed it to my parents with instructions to keep adding. They did. For a while. The album sat on the shelf in the living room of the house I grew up in. I can see it now in my memory. The pale blue spine, slightly faded after the first few years, from the afternoon light that came through the window at an angle and hit exactly that shelf. I grew up in a house that was full of photographs, not in a chaotic way, in the organized way of a family that is aware of itself. My mother, Carol, was the archivist. She labeled the backs of prints, organized them by year, and kept the albums in order. When I was small, she would take them down and tell me the stories of the images. That's your uncle before his beard. That's the dog we had before you were born. The photographs were the family's memory made visible. When my parents divorced, I was 14. My mother moved out. She took some photographs with her. The ones she was in mostly, and a few albums that had been hers before the marriage. My father kept the house. And with the house, the rest. Ruth's album. The years of Christmas mornings and birthday parties and summer vacations. The record of me from birth to 14, in a house that was now my father's, and 2 years later, my stepmother Diane's. I had assumed the photographs would be there whenever I needed them. Families do that. We assume the record is being kept. Looking back now, I should have asked. I should have taken an album with me when I left for university at 18. I should have known that things you leave behind are subject to decisions made by people who are not you. I didn't know. Not until I was 28 and called home to ask my father if I could get copies of some photographs from my apartment. And he said, "I'm not sure where those got to. I'm not sure where those got to." I read the sentence again in my memory as I write it. And I feel again what I felt then. Not alarm immediately, because the phrasing was too casual for alarm. More like a small wrongness. The specific sensation of reaching for something you know should be there and finding the space where it was. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "During the move. We went through a lot of things. Diane organized most of it." I said, "Which move?" He said, "When we sold the house. 3 years ago. I had known about the sale. I had not gone through the house before it was sold. I had not asked about the photographs. I had not thought to ask." He said, "I assumed they were with you, or with your mother." I said, "They were in the house when I left for university." He said, "I know. I'm not sure what happened to them." The wrongness became something sharper. I said, "My grandmother's album. The pale blue one she made." He said, I'll ask Diane. He asked Diane, and what Diane said, relayed through my father in the careful language of someone managing information, was that she had given a box of photographs to their neighbor Helen Marsh for a charity sale. Because she said they didn't know whose they were. They were photographs of a child from birth to 14. In a house where one child had lived. They didn't know whose they were. I did not call Diane. Not immediately. Not for several days. I called my friend Sam first. Sam has been my closest friend for 12 years. She grew up in a family that moved frequently and has the specific clarity of someone who understands what it means to have things lost in transit and what it means when the loss was a choice rather than an accident. I told her everything. She said, "They gave away your childhood photographs." I said, "To a charity sale?" She said, "Do you know which charity?" I said, "Helen Marsh, the neighbor. I need to call her." She said, "Do it today. Charity sale items can move fast." I found Helen Marsh's number through my father, who gave it to me with the slightly strained efficiency of a man who understood things were not going well but hadn't yet worked out the full extent of it. Helen answered on the third ring. She was warm in the way of people who have no idea they're about to be at the center of something difficult. I explained who I was, what I was looking for. "The box of photographs," she said. Oh dear, not H, I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh dear." The sound of someone who remembers something. She said, "I did have a box like that. From the Barlow house." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to be honest with you, Tess. The charity sale was 3 years ago." My stomach dropped. She said, "But..." She paused. "I couldn't sell them. I know that might sound strange, but they were clearly someone's. A child's whole life was in that box. I couldn't put a price on them." I said, "What did you do with them?" She said, "I gave them to a woman named Gloria Webb. She came to the sale and saw them, and she got very emotional. She said she'd had her own photographs lost in a house fire, and she understood what it meant. She asked if she could have them. She said she would try to find out who they belonged to." I said, "She's been trying to find me," Helen said. "I believe so, yes." She said, "I have her number if you'd like it." I called Gloria Webb that afternoon. She answered on the first ring as though she had been waiting. Maybe she had been waiting. She said, "Tess Barlow?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I've been hoping someone would call." I said, "You have my photographs." She said, "I have your photographs. Everyone. I put them in 2 albums to keep them safe. Your grandmother's album is there too. I found her name on the inside cover." I pressed my hand flat on my kitchen counter. She said, "I want you to know I've taken very good care of them. I couldn't find who to return them to. I tried your father's old address, but nobody was there, and I didn't know your name to search, just your grandmother's name and an address that had already changed." I said, "Ruth." Her name was Ruth. Gloria said, "She made a beautiful album." I said, "Yes, she did." She said, "I put a fresh sleeve over the cover to protect it." That wasn't the worst part of the story. That was actually the best part. The worst part came when I finally called Diane. I had the conversation with Diane on a Thursday evening. My father was on the call too, which was his decision and which I had not objected to. Whatever needed to be said in front of him. Diane explained, in the tone of someone who had prepared a position, that the box had been clearly labeled miscellaneous and had contained photographs of a child she assumed were from a previous family, not hers, not relevant to their new household. I said, "They were me." She said, "There were no names on the box." I said, "There were names on the backs of most of the photographs, and on the inside cover of the album." A pause. She said, "I didn't look through every photo." I said, "You gave them to a neighbor for a charity sale." She said, "I was organizing a house of 23 years of accumulated items. I made decisions about a lot of things quickly." I said, "Diane, those were my first 14 years." She said, "I understand that, and I'm sorry it's been distressing." I said, "Where did you think they should go?" A longer pause. She said, "I assumed if you'd wanted them, you would have taken them when you left." I said, "I left at 18. For university. I took 2 suitcases." She said, She stopped. My father said, "Tess, I should have been more careful. I know that. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not defensiveness, not the careful management of a difficult situation. Something closer to understanding what he was actually saying. He said, I should have made sure. Before anything was left in that house, he said, I didn't. And I'm sorry. I said, I'm going to get them back. I said, I found them. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then my father said, where? I said, a woman named Gloria Webb has had them for 3 years. She's been trying to find who they belong to. He was quiet. I said, she kept my grandmother's album safe. She put a protective sleeve on the cover. He said, Tess. I said, I'll call you after. Gloria Webb lived 40 minutes from me. I know that because the first thing I did after I hung up with my father was look up her address. She had offered to mail everything. I said, I would like to come in person if that's all right. She said, please come. We arranged for Saturday. Saturday was 4 days away. In those 4 days, I thought about what was coming. Not the photographs specifically, the conversation underneath them. The one I had been building towards since Thursday's phone call with my father. I called my mother on Friday. Carol lives 3 hours from me. She and I talk regularly with the honest quality of people who have worked on a relationship after a difficult period. She had not been directly involved in this. The photographs that were lost were the ones that stayed with my father's house, not the ones she had taken. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I knew she was hard on your things. I said, what do you mean? She said, when your father and Diane moved out of the house, a friend who lived nearby told me there had been a significant purge. I heard there were things disposed of. I said, why didn't you tell me? She said, I didn't know about the photographs. I assumed she'd been practical about furniture, about household things. I didn't think she would. She stopped. I said, she didn't think they were important. My mother said, or she thought they were mine to have kept, or she thought they weren't her problem to manage. I said, they were in her house. My mother said, yes, they were. She said, Tess, how are you? I said, I'm angry, and I'm going Saturday to get them back. And then I need to have a real conversation with Dad. She said, about Diane? I said, about his role. Diane made the decision. He lives in the house too. He knew I had a childhood. He knew the photographs existed. She said, yes. I said, he told me he assumed I'd taken them. She said, he knows that's not true. I said, I know. She said, what do you want from the conversation? I said, I want him to understand what was lost. And I want him to stop acting like Diane's decisions are separate from his. She said, they're married. I said, exactly. Have you ever had to sit with the loss for 4 days before you could go get it back, and the 4 days were almost harder than finding out? If you know that specific waiting, type enough in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to the Family Ledger yet, now is the time. Because Saturday is coming, and what happens at Gloria's door changes everything. My father called on Friday evening. He said, I've been thinking about what you said. I said, okay. He said, I want you to know I'm going to talk to Diane. I said, about what? He said, about what happened, about the photographs. I said, what are you going to say? He was quiet. He said, I'm going to tell her it wasn't the right decision, that those were yours, that she should have asked. I said, she should have asked. He said, I know. I said, and you should have made sure. He said, I know that too. He said, Tess, when you go on Saturday, I want to hear how it goes. I said, I'll call you. He said, I'm glad you found them. I said, a stranger kept them safe for 3 years, not because she knew who they belonged to, because she understood what they were. He said, I know. He said it with the specific weight of a man who understood exactly what that implied about his own choices. Diane did not call. I did not expect her to. What do you think I was most afraid of finding when Gloria opened her door? Option A, that some of the photographs were damaged or missing. Option B, that seeing them after 3 years of being lost would be too much to hold. Option C, that getting them back would feel like enough when the real problem was still unresolved. Drop your answer in the comments, because all three of those fears were real, and only one of them came true. Friday night. My apartment. I didn't sleep well. Not from anticipation exactly. From something harder to name, the specific state of being close to something you've been looking for and not yet having it in your hands. I had one photograph of myself from childhood that I'd taken to university at 18. Just one. I'd pulled it out of an album on impulse the morning I left, not knowing I wouldn't be back for the rest. It was a photograph of me at 7 years old. I was sitting on the back step of the house on a summer evening. I was eating a popsicle. I was not looking at the camera. I was looking at something in the yard, a bird or an insect or nothing, the way children look at nothing, and it's somehow the fullest attention. I had looked at this photograph my whole adult life and never been able to place it in context. What year was it? What was I looking at? Who had taken it? The answer was in a box in Gloria Webb's housey 40 minutes away. The tears came without warning. Not a collapse. A quiet overflow I let happen at my kitchen table on a Friday night. I cried for my grandmother Ruth, who had sewn a pale blue fabric cover and written my name in careful cursive and believed she was building something that would last. I cried for the 3 years the photographs had been in a stranger's house because no one in my own family had thought to ask where they were. And I cried for the 7-year-old on the back step, looking at whatever she was looking at, who had no idea that someday the record of her early life would be packed into a box labeled miscellaneous and sent to a neighbor for a sale. I wiped my face, set the photograph on the kitchen table, set my keys beside it, and went to bed. If someone kept something of yours, something they didn't have to keep, tell me about it in the comments. Those are the stories that remind me why I do this. And now let me tell you about Saturday. Saturday morning, 8:43. I pulled up to a house on Maple Crescent that had a small garden in the front. Very well tended, the kind that belongs to someone who pays attention to small things. I had driven the 40 minutes in near silence. The radio was off. I didn't feel like filling the space with anything. Gloria Webb opened the door before I reached the porch. She was in her late 60s with the specific quality of someone who has had her own losses and has come, through them, to understand what other people's losses mean. She looked at me the way people look at you when they've been thinking about you for 3 years. She said, "I've been hoping someone would come for these." She stepped back. I stepped in. Her house was warm and small and clean in the organized way of someone who has made careful decisions about what to keep. On the side table inside the door, arranged with the seriousness of something that had been waiting to be handed over, were 2 albums and a box. She said, "I transferred the loose photographs into a second album so they wouldn't get damaged. I hope that's all right." I said, "That's all right." She said, "And here." She handed me the pale blue fabric album. The cover had a protective plastic sleeve over it, exactly as she had said. Through the sleeve I could see the blue with white flowers, slightly faded from the years it had spent on the shelf in the house on Pelham Street and catching the afternoon light. I opened it. My name, my birth date, Ruth's handwriting. And on the first page, a photograph I had never seen. My mother and father on the day I came home from the hospital. My father was holding me. He looked terrified in the way new fathers look. My mother was looking at him instead of the camera, with an expression that I can only describe as the specific wonder of watching someone become a parent for the first time. I had never seen this photograph. I had not known it existed. I turned to the next page. And the next. Gloria brought tea. She left it on the table beside me and stepped into the kitchen to give me space. She understood without being told. I sat in her living room for 40 minutes, going through the albums. The 7-year-old on the back step, the one from my single photograph, appeared in 7 other images on the same day. I could see now it was a Sunday in July. There were other people in some of them, my uncle before his beard, a neighbor I vaguely remembered, and my grandfather, who died when I was 9. My grandfather, whom I had not seen in a photograph since I was 9 years old. Gloria came back with her own cup of tea. She said, "Are they all there?" I said. "All of them that I can count," she said. I counted 147 when I organized them. I'd hoped I hadn't missed any. I said, "Gloria, why did you keep them?" She sat down across from me. She said, "I had a house fire 8 years ago. I lost everything. Not just the practical things, the photographs, the record of my life before the fire. I know what it means to have that gone." She said, "When I saw that box at the sale and I understood what it was, I couldn't let it be sold for $1 to someone who didn't know whose life it was. I thought, if it were mine, I would want someone to keep it." She said, "So I kept it." I said, "For 3 years." She said, "I hoped. People find things. It just takes time." I looked at the pale blue album in my hands. I said, My grandmother made this. She said, I know. I read her name inside. I said, she died when I was 23. I didn't have anything she made. Not anymore. Gloria said nothing. She just looked at me with the specific gentleness of someone who understands that some things don't need a response. I said, thank you. She said, bring her home. The consequences fell slowly, the way the consequences of this kind of thing always do. I called my father from the car outside Gloria's house. He answered immediately. I said, I have them. He said, all of them. I said, 147, and Gran's album. He was quiet. I said, a woman kept them for 3 years because she lost her own photographs in a house fire and understood what it meant to lose them. She organized them into albums to keep them safe. She put a protective sleeve on Gran's cover. He said, I don't know what to say. I said, I'm going to come over. Not today. Next weekend, and I'd like to have a real conversation. He said, okay. I said, about what it means that this happened, not just the photographs. What it means is that they were in your house and they were given away and nobody thought to tell me. He said, I understand. He said, Diane and I talked last night. I said, okay. He said, she understands it was wrong. She said she thought. He stopped. It doesn't matter what she thought. It was wrong. I said, yes. He said, I'm going to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. I said, I'd like to know what that looks like. He said, yes. We can talk about it next weekend. Diane sent me a text that evening. Short. Careful. It said, I know I can't undo this. I'm sorry. I should have asked. I read it 3 times. I did not respond immediately. I responded 3 days later with, I appreciate that. We'll talk when I come next weekend. Not warm. Not cold. Honest. My mother called on Sunday evening. She said, did you get them? I said, everyone. She said, and your grandmother's album? I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, what did it feel like? Getting them back. I thought about it. I said, like recovering a version of myself I didn't know I'd lost. Not just the images, the proof that the years happened, that they were real, that I was there and other people were there, and we were all in the same place at the same time. She said, yes. She said, that's exactly what photographs are for. The photograph of 7-year-old me, the one I'd taken to university at 18, the one I'd looked at for 13 years without context. I framed it alongside one from the recovered set. The same Sunday, the same backstep. My grandfather is in the background of one of them, at the edge of the frame, looking at something out of shot. The context made both photographs different. That's what the family record does. It gives you the context for the images you were already carrying. I went to my father's house the following weekend. He had made lunch. The table was set more carefully than usual. I noticed this the way you notice small preparations when someone is trying to tell you something without saying it directly. Diane was there. This was her choice and my father's. They had discussed it. She sat at the table with the specific posture of someone who has decided to be present rather than absent and isn't entirely comfortable with the decision. I had the pale blue album with me. I set it on the table between the plates. My father looked at it for a long time. He said, I haven't seen that in years. I said, since the move? He said, before the move even. It was on the shelf in the living room. I walked past it every day. And then he stopped. I stopped walking past it. He said, I should have made sure it came with us. I said, yes. He said, I should have made sure all of them did. Diane said, I'm sorry, Tess. I looked at her. I said, I believe you, and I need to say something directly. She said, okay. I said, those photographs represented 31 years of family history. Not just mine, your husband's, his parents. His whole story before you married into it. When you made the decision to give them away without asking, you were deciding all of that. Not just about me. She said, I understand that now. I said, I'd like us to get to a place where things that belong to this family are treated as belonging to this family. Whether or not we're all in the same house, she said. I can commit to that. She said it carefully, not defensively. I believed it was real. My father opened the pale blue album. He turned the pages slowly. His mother's handwriting is inside the cover. His face in the hospital photograph, the terrified new father holding the tiny version of me. He stopped on a page near the middle. He said, I remember this day. I looked. A summer afternoon. A birthday, from the streamers visible in the corner. My grandfather is at the edge of the frame. My father said. My dad, he said it quietly. I said, yes. He said, I didn't know this photograph existed. I said, neither did I. Until Saturday. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the album gently. He said, thank you for forgetting them. I said, thank you for letting me have this conversation. He said, I'm glad Gloria kept them. I said, me too. The pale blue album is on my bookshelf now. I can see it from where I'm sitting. The protective sleeve Gloria put over the cover has stayed on. It doesn't make the faded blue fabric less itself. It just keeps it from fading further. I've been thinking about what this year taught me. Not about Diane's decision, not about my father's role, about the photographs themselves. A photograph is a witness, not just a record, a witness. It says, this happened. These people were in the same place at the same time. This moment was real. When the photographs are gone, the witnessing stops. The moments don't disappear. They happened. They're permanent in the way that past things are permanent. But the visible proof of them disappears. The thing that said you were there and they were there and this was your life, that's gone. My grandmother Ruth understood this. She spent a summer making an album from fabric she had been saving for something worth making because she understood that the record of a life is one of the few things that can outlast the life it records. She put it on a shelf and trusted it would stay. She couldn't have known about the move. She couldn't have known about the miscellaneous box. She couldn't have known about Gloria Webb, who had lost her own record in a house fire and understood, when she saw a stranger's life in a box at a charity sale, exactly what it meant to lose it. I am grateful for Gloria Webb in a way that is difficult to fully articulate. She did not know me. She owed me nothing. She kept 147 photographs and a handmade album safe for 3 years because she believed someone would eventually come looking. People do that. They hold things for strangers because they know what it means to have things held. The family ledger, not this channel, the actual record, the physical evidence of who was where and when, is one of the most important things a family carries. And it is more fragile than we think. It can be moved. It can be lost. It can be packed into a box labeled miscellaneous and given to a neighbor and nearly disappear. The way to protect it is to know what it is. To know that the photographs on the shelf are not decoration. They are the record. They are the witnesses. They are the proof that your family existed in specific places at specific times and looked the way they looked and loved the way they loved. They deserve to be treated accordingly. I didn't win against my father and stepmother. There's no winning in a situation where something important was nearly lost. You just recover what you can and understand more clearly what it was worth. The album is on the shelf. The photographs are in their sleeves. My grandfather's in 3 of them. The 7-year-old on the back step now has her context. That's enough. That's more than enough. It's everything Ruth built it to be. Has someone ever kept something of yours? Something that didn't belong to them? Something they could have let go because they understood what it meant? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've ever lost a piece of your family's record, to a move, to a decision, to time, tell me about that too. Those stories matter here. This is the Family Ledger. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Type witness in the comments if this one stayed with you. A new story every day. I'll see you tomorrow.